The screaming skull of Bettiscombe Manor. I should have never agreed to stay at Bettiscombe Manor. I thought it would be a peaceful retreat, a chance to get away from the chaos of city life. But something in that house, something old and angry, was waiting for me. And now, I can never forget the sound of its screams. Bettiscombe Manor sat on the edge of the Dorset countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient trees. The building itself was a relic of another time, its stone walls darkened by centuries of wind and rain. The air inside was damp, carrying the smell of old wood and decay, and the rooms seemed to extend into shadowy places that no sunlight could reach. The caretaker, Mrs. Wren, was an elderly woman with a permanent frown etched into her face. She showed me to my room with little more than a nod, but before she left, she paused at the threshold. "Stay out of the west wing," she said, her voice low, "and whatever you do, don't move the skull." I thought she was joking. A skull? Surely that was just some old superstition. But the look in her eyes told me she was deadly serious. I laughed it off and thanked her, but her words stuck with me. It was only later, when I heard the screams, that I realized how foolish I had been to ignore her. The first few days were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The halls were unnervingly quiet, and every creak of the floor seemed to echo far too loudly in the silence. On the third night, I decided to explore the manor, despite Mrs. Wren's warning. My curiosity got the better of me, and as the moonlight filtered through the windows, I found myself drawn to the west wing. At the end of a long, narrow corridor stood a single door, slightly ajar. Inside was a small, dusty room, no larger than a closet. In the center of the room, resting on an old wooden table, was a human skull. It was discolored with age, its empty eye socket staring blankly into space. A strange chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at the thing. I don't know why I did it, but I reached out and touched the skull. The moment my fingers brushed against the cold bone, I felt a sudden rush of air, as if the room itself had exhaled. The temperature dropped sharply and a low, distant moan echoed through the walls. I pulled my hand back, heart racing. It was just a skull, just a stupid old skull. But deep down, I knew something had changed. That night, the screaming began, and it started just after midnight, a high-pitched, agonizing wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up in bed, frozen with fear, as the sound echoed through the manor. It wasn't human, that much I was sure of. It was something else, something ancient and filled with rage. I ran to the door and flung it open, but the sound only grew louder. The very walls seemed to vibrate with the force of the scream, and I could feel the floor tremble beneath my feet. I stumbled through the halls, desperate to find the source, but no matter where I went, the screaming followed. Finally, I found myself standing outside the door to the west wing. The skull. It had to be the skull. I had touched it, disturbed it, and now it was angry. The door to the small room was closed, but the screaming was louder here, as if the skull itself was crying out in rage. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. I had to do something. I had to stop it. I burst into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The skull was there, still sitting on the table, but now it seemed different. The air around it shimmered, and the shadows in the room twisted and writhed as if alive. The scream was deafening now, a constant piercing wail that rattled my bones. Without thinking, I grabbed the skull and lifted it from the table. The moment I did, the screaming stopped. I stood there, trembling, the skull heavy in my hands, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, from deep within the house, I heard a low, guttural voice whisper, "Put it back." I turned and ran, clutching the skull to my chest. The manor seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in, the corridors stretching longer and darker. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "Put it back." I reached the front door and flung it open, the cold night air rushing in. Without thinking, I hurled the skull out into the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the screaming returned louder than ever. The scream tore through the night, a sound so terrible it made my vision blur. I staggered back into the house, hands over my ears, but the sound was inside my skull, vibrating through my bones. I could feel it. Something was coming. Something was angry. I ran through the halls, desperate to escape, but every door I opened led me deeper into the manor. The shadows seemed to reach for me, twisting into grotesque shapes that writhed and clawed at my skin. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath my feet cracked and splintered. I collapsed in the main hall, the screaming so loud now that it felt like the air itself was tearing apart. And then I saw it, an apparition, tall and gaunt, its face twisted in fury. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and in its hands, it held the skull. "You should not have touched it," the figure hissed, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Now, you will never leave." I woke in my bed, drenched in sweat. The manor was silent once more, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, and made my way to the front door. I had to leave. I had to get out of that house. But when I opened the door, I was no longer in Dorset. The landscape outside was barren, a twisted, desolate wasteland under a blood-red sky. The manor, it seemed, had claimed me. And in the distance, carried on the wind, I could still hear the faint sound of screaming. If you ever find yourself near Bettiscombe Manor, heed the warnings. Do not enter the West Wing. Do not touch the skull. Some things are better left undisturbed, because once you hear the scream, it never really stops.